Hi, I'm Sally Travaskis, Chair of the UCATA Board of Trustees. Every year we organise the UCATA National Conference and we would love to see you there. Each conference is full of inspiration, fresh ideas and offers the opportunity to connect and reconnect with friends, colleagues and peers in the world of transactional analysis. It's a weekend full of new learning and powerful conversations with transactional analysts and trainees from across the country. Join us this April in Nottingham for the UCATA National Conference. You can book your place now to connect, learn and be inspired.
In a way, you could say that the culture of an organisation is the script of an organisation. A lot of the culture is unconscious and is the plan, the map of what really is followed in the organisation.
Welcome to the Transactional Analysis Podcast, conversations about the theory, application and spirit of TA, brought to you in partnership with the United Kingdom Association for Transactional Analysis.
Rosemary, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, John. Hi, Josh.
Hey, Rosemary.
Good to have you here with us and give you some space to introduce yourself. Say a bit about who you are, your professional context.
So I'm Rosemary Napper and I'm an organisational training and supervising transactional analyst. I also happen to be qualified in the education and counselling fields as well. But organisations was my first qualification. And I did train originally in psychotherapy. However, I knew when I was in it that I wanted to be organisational, and there wasn't at that point much option around organisational TA training. And when I finished my psychotherapy training, and I did practice as a psychotherapist, and decided I was going to qualify in organisational, my TA trainer was forbidden to get an expansion to take me into that field. And so I had to go and do a second training with somebody who by then had set up organisational training.
What took you to TA in the first place?
Well, I worked as head of learning and development in a large organisation, and I wanted an in-depth framework. I had lots and lots and lots of bits of theory and practice and ideas and models from all sorts of things. But I wanted something that was in-depth. And I particularly wanted to do organisational because I'd had a really traumatic, dire experience when I was working in an organisation in Australia where consultants were brought in. And it was a really interesting situation. This organisation had been set up as a very special and incredibly well-funded project in Australia. And the people who set it up, the department that set it up with two heads. So there were two CEOs, if you like, to this organisation. One to look after the operational side and one to look after the vision and the product side. And as you might imagine, without very careful thought around whose decisions reign on what, these two fought like cats. And after a year and millions of dollars, nothing had been produced. And the consultants were brought in. And I knew nothing about consultancy at that time. But the consultants were brought in and spoke to everybody, which is what all good consultants should do, to speak to every individual. But clearly didn't have an understanding of organisations and the structure of organisations being really significant. They listened, they heard about the dynamics, and then they joined in a way, with the gains, which I would now say were going on. And they called us all together, including these two CEOs, and then publicly blamed and shamed one of them and glorified the other And I thought that was so unethical. Because it was really clear to me it was the setup of the organization that was the problem and had created all sorts of issues. It wasn't about these two people not getting, but actually one of them should have been appointed as being overall in charge. So I left, but it had got me interested in organizations. And here I am, 30 years later, maybe more.
And when you started the psychotherapy training, did that begin to shed some light on what had happened in the organization, or do you feel like it was too individual focused?
It was much too individual focused. It shed light on me. It provided some ideas. And I had a trainer who actually worked in organizations herself and had got a couple of other people who trained with a much more organizational TA focus. And they had done some things of really thinking about the culture of the organization and using some of the TA ideas to describe the culture. So I found it very helpful about me and how I need to be when I work. But I trained in psychotherapy because that's all there was back then. That was it.
Rosemary, I'm really curious when you speak about the culture of the organization. I know there are so many ideas out there about, what the culture is. Is it the values? Is it this? When you speak about the culture of the organization, what do you mean?
Yeah. So you're right. There's 440 different definitions of culture that I researched a few years back out there and have listed. In TA, there are 4 models of culture. There's Berne, there's Tony White, there's Denton Roberts, and there's my development of Berne. And there's talking about cultural script. So what I mean is really how the structures of the organization impact the dynamics, and that in turn co-creates with the structures the climate of the organization, what Berne called the character of the organization. Berne talked about the dynamics as being the etiquette, the rules. What do we actually do around here? Whereas the structure might say this is what should happen around here. And the character of the organization is not just what we actually do around here, but encompasses perhaps both the light and shadow of the feel of the organization. So if I put it in another way, and I very much have a development of Berne's ideas here, I think he was brilliant around this. The structures are all the tangible aspects of an organization. Literal structures, staffing charts, hierarchies, processes, procedures, recruitment policies, vision, mission, all that stuff. The dynamics are really about how people behave, which will include which of those structures do they ignore, which do they big up, and what do they actually do with regard to each other. And TA's clearly got loads and loads of ideas there about strokes and drivers and all sorts of transactions, all sorts of other behavioral aspects. If we go back to the structures, Berne came up with a long list of different structures and had conceptual ideas about that. The culture, the character is intangible. You can observe the dynamics. You can literally do searches and find and touch, if you like, the structures. But the culture, and yet when you walk into an organization for the first time, you smell it, you taste it. It's intangible, it's invisible, and yet if you've got your intuition, your A1 switched on, along with your adult observing self, you pick it up immediately. And I think everybody does. don't think that's unique to being trained in TA. I think we can all walk into any system and immediately get a feel for the culture. The people who are in the system, after about 6 months, that honeymoon period where there's a lot of what's going on here, I'm not sure, maybe I like it, maybe I don't, all that sort of stuff. After about 6 months or so, when the honeymoon's over, the culture has got inside people. It's interjected into the parent ego state. It might also get reified, simplified, and become part of the P1 in the child ego state as well. And it's just part of this is how it is. And that is what is so interesting, is culture and changing the culture.
When you moved from psychotherapy training to an org solely focus, because you couldn't do, I think you said because you couldn't do your exam without doing this additional training. What you just shared there, is this what got clarified for you in that second?
Sadly, not at all. So the training I went and did, and I think this is still typical of a lot of organisational TA training, was along the lines of an organisation is made up of people. TA is about all sorts of aspects of people working, being together, individuals, personalities. So we apply all of that and just expand it a bit to organisations. So sadly, it wasn't. It was only after I got qualified. And I spent 3 years before I set up organisational TA training. Once I was qualified, I went back and I read everything I could lay my hands on of Berne and his 2 books, so Structure and Dynamics of Organisations and Groups, and Principles of Group Treatment, and a lot of TAJ papers. And later I found some other papers which were never published in Berne's archive when I went to San Francisco. And there is a whole lot there which really is about this. Structures and Dynamics of Organisations and Groups is about organisational culture and how it develops.
I'm just back from the World Conference in France, which you are also, Rosemary, and there was an acknowledgement in one of the keynotes there that, we don't know what Berne would have written if he had lived longer, and that really so much of his work was unfinished.
Yeah.
Definitely for me, it was the first time where I felt like that was publicly acknowledged amongst the community. I've heard people say it before, but it seemed to be a focus at that conference in some way. And I guess what I'm hearing you say is that you began to make sense of ideas or perspectives he had, which maybe weren't well clarified in his writing.
Yeah, not well clarified in his writing. And my understanding is his publishers were a pornography press, so it's not surprising they weren't well edited and all the rest of it. But I think Freud went on and lived many, 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 many years and developed ideas and changed ideas. Berne formally spent about 12 years doing TA ideas and was doing psychotherapy and also actually a lot of counselling ideas, and had done this book on organisations, and had much, much earlier, before he became TA, had really thought about organisations. He was working inside a mental hospital. He was fascinated by the parallel process, effectively, between staff and patients, and how the whole structure of the hospital, the literal building, the structures in other ways, really constrain people to behave in particular ways. So he was already writing and thinking about that back in the 1930s. And I'm sure he would have, I would hope he would have gone on and done a whole lot more, and also tidied himself up. So one of the things I did in the Life Scripts group book was try and tidy up what he's saying in Structures Dynamics book and create a diagram. Berne loved diagrams. He was very much for the Occam's razor, keep it simple, get really smart with it. And I'm sure he would have developed something himself. I mean, I know that lots of the diagrams in the early TA literature, because of the typography available at the time, are not quite what was expressed when he was drawing on blackboards, which apparently he was, with squeaky bits of chalk. And a blackboard still existed in his study when I went to stay in his house in San Francisco, or in Carmel. And in his shed, which was his study, there was the typewriter and a blackboard with ego states on it and round things, whereas some of the typography got lost.
Rosemary, I want to go back to something you said earlier when you were speaking about the structures, dynamics, and culture. And you said a phrase about the culture getting inside of people.
Yeah.
And I'm really curious about what does that mean? What does it look like when the culture of the organization gets inside of an individual?
So it's introjected, just like we might introject individuals into the parent ego state. We can introject culture. And Pearl Drago did a good job of turning Berne's culture model into 3 elliptical circles of etiquette, techniques, and character, and shows these being introjected in exactly the same way. It's an unconscious process that we take in the culture of the organization into our parent ego state, along with interjecting bosses and powerful people. When we're in our grown-up lives at work, we will interject partially or wholly.
It sounds like an organization has a personality, is alive.
Well, Berne talked about the word character, but he was very careful in his book not to use the terminology that he had used for individuals around organizations. So he doesn't talk about the personality of an organization. He talks about the culture having a character or characteristics of the culture. And I think that's a really, really important thing. I've seen some terrible TA applying the ego state model to organizations, for example, which is inappropriate to do. There's a whole set of theories and concepts for individuals. And Berne was quite careful to develop a whole lot of terminology and concepts about organizations. And the two are not the same. An organization is not a person. It's much more than the people who work within it. It's a gestalt, because there is structures. There's a legal entity to an organization. His basic rule of organizations is they will survive at any cost. An organization will survive. And if you've attempted to disband an organization or to shut down an organization, it's extremely difficult. It has an entity beyond the people, and that's in the structures, and the culture will linger. So people who shut down an organization or go off and start a new one have to be very careful. And I've seen this with TA associations, which are organizations or systems. People don't like the organizations they're in, and they go and set up a new one. But of course, they are taking with them the interjects from the old organization. And when they create the new organization, lo and behold, the organizational games that develop are just the same as the ones they were trying to get away from in the old organization.
I'm sitting with the tension between what people probably know TA to be. If they know any TA, they'll know things like ego states, transactions, games, script. Yeah, it's probably fair to say that most people, even people who know very little, might associate those things as being TA. And it sounds like what you're putting forward, Rosemary, is that when it comes to the application of TA in organizations, it's not those things at all. And Berne had a completely different kind of focus or
Well,
perspective.
it includes some of those. So transactions, for example, go on in organizations. People use functional modes. But he had a whole lot of other concepts about an organization, about systems, about boundaries, about membership, about leadership, about the constitution of organizations, about groups. Sadly, he didn't go far enough to differentiate teams from groups, about the forces which are in organizations, which keep the boundaries in place, which regulate what's going on. And in a way, you could say that the culture of an organization is the script of an organization. A lot of the culture is unconscious and is the plan, the map of what really is followed in the organization. I'm sure you know that apocryphal story about the monkeys put in a cage. Do you know? When monkeys were put in a cage, a banana was put on top of a ladder, and the alpha monkey, the leader, looked around, checked, and headed for the banana. And when the leader headed for the banana, all the monkeys got sprayed with water, and he let go of the banana, left it on top of the ladder. A monkey's removed, a new monkey comes into the cage and notices the banana, looks around, can't understand why nobody's eating the banana, heads for it, and all the other monkeys attack that monkey. Another monkey is removed, same process happens. Gets to the stage where all the monkeys that were there when the water was sprayed have gone. It's all new monkeys. They never saw the original incident. And what we see happening is another monkey comes along, new monkey, heads for the banana, and all the monkeys who are already there attack that monkey. That's what organizational culture is like. People need not have been there at the original incident, but the fear, the aggression, and so on is in the culture and gets acted out when something is going to happen. So, for example, there's an organization I work with at the moment, and new people coming in after about 6 months find themselves full of fear. And what happens in this organization, it turns out, about every 10 years, is there is a public execution, i.e. somebody who's good and valued in the organization is publicly gotten rid of. It puts fear into everybody. You needn't have been around. People often don't talk about it because it was such a horrendous happening. But when new people come into the organization, after a while, they notice they're feeling afraid. That's part of the culture of that organization is fear. And they're not sure what they're afraid of, but there is a sense that it's not safe. They're not secure. That's how culture can work. You needn't know of what happened originally, and you might not have been around to see anything, but you pick it up. It gradually gets inside you. Does that make sense?
It really does, Rosemary, and it's bringing up for me even clearer what you said about some pieces of TA theory that are meant for the psychotherapeutic modality or area being inappropriate, because my sense is perhaps in that story of an individual feeling fear, there may be a temptation to say that's a script piece. That fear doesn't belong to the individual, it belongs to the system.
Absolutely. So you might have a system which is bullying, for example. And I have seen in a TA exam in psychotherapy, somebody supervising a psychotherapist who had a client who'd been referred to them who was being bullied in the organization. And this psychotherapist was saying in the supervision exam, well, I've been through her script. We've uncovered all her childhood, and I really can't find her being a victim, but she must be a victim because she's being bullied in this organization. And one of my organizational colleagues on the exam board, who was also a psychotherapist, stood up and said, "Stop this exam." And I really respect her for doing this. She said, "Bullying is part of an organizational culture. This is not about individual games. This is about a culture in an organization. This person is bad luck that this person has ended up in this organization. And it's also bad luck that this person's been referred to psychotherapy." I can understand that she obviously felt she was going crazy with what was going on, but this is not a psychotherapy issue. It's not even persecution in game or drama triangle theory. Bullying is not persecuted. Bullying is done consciously. Games for individuals are about the individual's script in action. Games in organizations are about the organizational culture in action. That every decade, the public execution, that would be a second degree organizational game in action. And that's part of the culture. It's not about the individuals who had the bad luck in a way to be there. And to some extent, some individuals' own scripts might fit with an organizational script, but that's not the point. The point is, how does the organization perpetuate itself? And there's a wonderful theory of organizational games that again needs tightening up and expanding from Oz Summerton, a bit like Peldrago, also from North India, where he was working, which really looks at there being a lot more than a scapegoat and possibly a savior and snipers, but actually there's a stage manager, there's spectators. And I would add that there's maybe some other roles in this organizational games, which are also in the background, which is the stage director, which might be the current style of the CEO and in the organization at that time, or whatever's topical. There is a producer, a stage producer. There is the provision of resources to the organization. And there is the script writer. That's the founder or founders of an organization. And what we need to look at in organizational games is what's going on, not on the stage with the scapegoat and the savior or the sniper, but actually all these background roles who are keeping something in place. They might not know, just like the stage manager who puts the props on the stage, puts the gun on the desk, ready for the murder in a popular play. They might not even really know what it's all about. They're not interested, but they know the gun's got to go on the desk at this time. It's that equivalent goes on in an organization. Lots of people may take part in organizational games without really knowing what it is they're involved in. Does that make sense to you guys? In your experiences of workplaces, systems, and of course, systems are more than just organizations. There are political systems and national systems and so on, which again, Berne was great. He picked up on all of that. Sort of societies as organizations, or nowadays we will say systems, as well as small little family businesses. And when you've got a family business, you've obviously got some real interplay between a family script and an organizational script. Very interesting.
I'm picking up from what you're saying, Rosemary, that as a practitioner, if you're an organizational transactional analyst, that it's the system is actually your client rather than any of the people that work there or the owner.
Absolutely. And this is clearly true if you're a consultant. It is also true if you're a coach. You are coaching people to enable the system. And that might mean some psychoeducation about culture and about systems. In my experience, leaders generally don't understand they are leading a culture. They are leading a system. And they do have a little bit more influence in the leadership positions than in the membership positions, but only a little bit.
And I think that might be some of the sticking points, right? So when I think of TA, comes from a psychoanalytic background, it very much has taken up residency as a kind of a humanistic and integrative approach. Most people class it that way. And when it comes to the organizational application, that's actually somewhat unhelpful because we're not actually really working with individuals in the organizational application. And it requires you to think differently. Like, it requires you to think, I'm not here for this person that's sitting in front of me solely. I'm here to work on the system so that we can change, resolve, improve the system for the people that work there. But that's a very different approach to other applications.
Absolutely. It's spot on, John. And there's no reason why we can't get there. The psychodynamic modality has always had an organizational aspect since the 1920s. And there is organizational psychodynamic work. The Tavistock does masters in it. And I was very influenced because I went on from my psychotherapy TA training to teach on a psychotherapy and counselling program at Oxford University for many years. And it had an organizational psychodynamic thread as well. And that helped me get really familiar. There's plenty of literature there about the unconscious of the organizations. And this, I think, is really key. And we would be grandiose to think that we can really change an organization. A culture has got a life of its own. We can nudge by tinkering with the systems and at the same time supporting different dynamics through coaching and training, tinkering with the system through interventions to the structures and bits of re-engineering and redesigning. And we have to do both of those at once over a long period of time, several years, of really paying attention to that if we're going to bring about cultural change. And that's very different from the borrowing of counselling and psychotherapy into, for example, coaching, or even worse, into consultancy. We really do need a different frame of reference and a different perspective, and Berne had it.
Rosemary, now that you touched upon coaching and the importance of being aware of the system that the individual is in, I'm curious about, what do you see as the potential pitfalls or dangers if coaches, for example, aren't attuned and aware of the system that their client sits within?
So they see no impact of how the system is influencing the behavior, not just of their client, but the people the client is working with inside the organization. And there is a lot of blaming of individuals that then goes on. And I do think there's some real ethical issues. If people haven't got a systemic understanding and are able to support the client in differentiating what belongs to the organization and what belongs to themselves as an individual, and to be able to look around in their teams or in their hierarchies and make that differentiation is crucial. Otherwise, we're into an ethical perpetuation of games, both individual games and organizational games, blame games, and so on. So important. And it's where I really respect my psychodynamic colleagues who seem to know this. And I can't quite get why many TA colleagues, both in the psychotherapy field and in the organisation field, don't have this clarity, because Berne did have it. And partly maybe that's because of the mess that was made back in the 70s, 80s and into the 90s of calling it special fields. Maybe it's because Berne himself got a bit hijacked by the behaviourist developments in the States. He never really had a disciple that wasn't in the psychotherapy / counselling field, an organisational person, and maybe that would have made a difference. Who knows? But there isn't that grasp, which seems to me to be so clear and so obvious, both in the original TA literature, but also in the wider world around us. We would do well to look at other modalities.
I'm thinking about how the fields, in a way, although they're helpful for clarifying the context of the application, probably don't actually go far enough to emphasize the difference. So, like, I'm just thinking in my mind about how there's like individual application 1-to-1, and then couples could be an application, and then you've got groups, teams, and organizations, which is slightly different. But it depends with groups whether people are there because they want to work on something in the group process, or whether they each want to work on something individually, but just in a group setting. So there's this clarification needed as a practitioner, I think, about what are you doing, and are you clear on whether you're doing an individual application or a systemic application?
Yeah. And if you're working with people in organizations, if the organization is paying, you, I think, ethically need to be working systemically and have a systemic application, have a really good understanding of systems. If you're working with the individual's personality, then you're working in psychotherapy. If you're working with an individual to enable their self-management and resources and problem solving, you're working in the counselling field. If you're working with an individual to develop their learning, it's the educational field. And if you're working with an individual about matters relating to being in a workplace, if you're coaching or mentoring or performance managing that person, you need a systemic frame of reference. Just like in the educational field, you need a learning frame of reference. Just like in the psychotherapy field, you need a frame of reference, which is really about the nature of the child ego state and the wounding that might be there of individuals. It's not to say that individuals who are in psychotherapy can't also be members of organizations. I mean, many are. But indeed, that's another reason why it's important that people doing psychotherapy training should have a bit of an understanding, and it's supposed to be in the 101, the difference between the fields of the field, so that that psychotherapist can help them sort out what belongs to them as a person and what might be going on in the workplace and is way beyond an individual to be able to manifest change with what's going on there. Systems generally are huge and complex, and it is rare that an individual can change a system. Needs buy-in from the power holders, the stakeholders of the system, not just an individual.
Which is why I think sometimes practitioners might be tempted to just not go there because it feels kind of insurmountable, like climbing Everest. It's like, well, I'm coaching this individual here, so I'll just focus on developing capacity in this individual and I won't bother because it feels challenging or difficult.
And yet you probably can't develop capacity in the individual because the constraints of the organization and the culture will not allow that capacity to be expressed. So you end up coaching that person to leave. And that happens so often.
Yeah.
Yeah. At the same time, let's say that person is also in a leadership role in some way. Their development as a leader is not being developed because the person doing the coaching doesn't have an understanding of what leadership is, and nor does the client. And that psychoeducation aspect of what is leadership at the psychological level is really important. So just as the unconscious of the system itself is really important to have an understanding that there is an unconscious to a system, it's also really important to understand that there are psychological aspects and unconscious aspects to leadership within, and leadership is always within a system. And that system will always impact the leadership role and what's possible.
I'm slowing myself down because there's so much I would like to open up.
And that, Josh, is a 3-year advanced TA training in organisation. Absolute. Yeah.
And I'm aware of time.
Yeah. And that's why I do a 3-year program. 1 year is on the system itself, which is what we've been talking about a lot here. Another year is on the individual in the system and coaching and mentoring and performance management. And we've touched on that a bit here. And the 3rd year is on groups and teams inside systems and team coaching and leading of teams and facilitating, which is another whole area.
I think one of the reasons I've also slowed down and gone thoughtful is because I noticed that the more we talk about systems, particularly maybe large organizational ones, it feels quite heavy. I don't know if that's my stuff, but I noticed that goes on for me. It feels like too big for me or something like that, which may be a dilemma for an organizational practitioner. I don't know.
Well, I think as an organizational practitioner, it's a really good idea to work with others, not to work alone. Yeah, in a small organization maybe, but to create a team of you. And that's one of the things I love about TA training is I see these teams forming of people working together. And it's like, great, because you need a number of you so that you've got a range of survey points, a range of perspectives, and so that you can become a parallel system. And what will go on in your consultancy team parallels what's going on in the organization. And to have the sort of supervision where you can monitor that, so exciting, it's so interesting, fascinating. You can't do it alone. And then within organizations, what I found people say, and I think this is so interesting, is the easiest, even if they're large, the easiest sort of organizations to work with are the profit-making commercial organizations, because it's so simple, really, what they're all about.
Yes.
Which is
right.
Whereas working with charities, oh my goodness. I was on a London bus going through Clapham yesterday and sitting next to somebody, and she and I had a great conversation. She works for a really large charity and was finding the people in the charity were driving her nuts. And I had a 5-minute conversation really clarifying that the motivations of people who join a charity and the purpose of a charity is so different from a commercial business. And given that her role was all about the money and she'd come from a commercial business to the charity and was in charge of dealing out the money, it really was an aha moment for her in that 5 minutes on the number 24.
So to do full circle, Rosemary, if you knew what you know now when you had been involved in this project in Australia, what would you have done?
Well, I would have named things. I think naming things is really, really important. And actually, looking back, I did attempt to, but I didn't know how to. And I think I was in the middle of the organisation. I wasn't a leader and therefore not listened to. And there is something about the power holders, the stakeholders in an organisation are more likely to have been heard. I did attempt to say, I don't think it's about these two people not getting on. Yes, I can see they fight like crazy, but how come they fight like crazy? What is it? It's so obvious. They are equal in this setup, and therefore whose decision prevails? Of course they're going to fight. Of course. But I wasn't heard, and the consultants didn't have a frame of reference, which was really about listening. They had also come, I suspect, out of a counselling origin, and they'd been in organisations themselves earlier, and they came with a frame of it's the people, it's the personalities. And yet we all know, don't we, when we say it's a personality clash in a workplace, if one of those people leaves, or even both, the same sort of clashing and conflict pops up amongst other people. It's like a game of whack-a-mole. And that tells almost everybody with a few years' experience of workplaces that it's not about the personalities. That's not the answer. That's a simplistic, I was going to say solution, but it's not a solution. It's like a Band-Aid, which actually, as a Band-Aid in itself, is toxic. It's really unhealthy. Look deeper.
Which I guess is the thing that, for me, I feel like I've been continuously invited to do in studying TA, which is go to the psychological level, what's really going on here.
Absolutely. And an organization, a system, has, if you like, a psychological level. It has an energy, it has an energy of its own, and that impacts people psychologically. And it may be out of awareness. And is therefore picked up and interjected and carried by people. So it's perpetuated. It's fascinating. Fascinating. That's the thing I want to get across to people. Not that you can easily prove, oh, I changed this organization. Because it's not like that. But it's a really interesting investigation. And actually the people inside the organization have to make the decision to change the organization, not the consultants.
I was picking up on what you shared there in that example, and patterns in the organization being a really useful way for individuals who are going into an organization, maybe as a coach or consultant, to really clarify what's theirs and what's the organization's.
It's absolutely what we look at, patterns. Just as you might with individuals be looking at patterns. What's the repeated patterns in the organization? And I would say more than the coach and the consultant, Joshua, it's for everybody in everyday life. Almost everybody works inside organizations or belongs to an organization or is a member of an organization, maybe is looking for a new career, which would involve an organization. You know, take a good look, talk to people informally, go and have a look before you join. And that includes TA associations. They're organizations too. And some are more toxic than others.
Implicit in that statement is that they're all toxic.
Of course, there is no perfect organization. And that would be simplistic. There is, all organizations have a culture, a script. There's always a shadow. And some are much healthier than others.
Mm.
And some of us are attracted to health, and some of us are attracted to toxicity. And that is to do with individual script. That's the business of psychotherapy and counselling. What patterns are you attracted to?
My sense, I know I always declaring that I don't read and I'm not a big reader, but I still think that books are important and a lot of people read and learn in that format. It doesn't seem to me like there's been a lot published in terms of books in the organizational application post Berne in comparison to other fields of application that could clarify or that could distill some of his early thinking. That feels like such a shame.
I absolutely agree, John. And I think we, in TA, not many of us are writers. Many more of us are trainers and teachers. And therefore, podcasts are a great way of getting some of these ideas across. Getting them to written form, I think, is really hard. And that's partly because we are talking about the invisible, the smell, the feel of the system. And once things are put into print on a page, they become ossified. And meaning is made, which is not the meaning intended. So the whole business of writing, I think, is extraordinarily difficult. And what has been written in organisational TA, a lot of it is not about systems and hasn't got a systemic approach. Ben Schmidt, some of his writings were about systems. A lot of that's available on the web as papers, more than books. Yeah. And one day, maybe I will get that book out.
And in the meantime, Rosemary, if people were to approach structures and dynamics, because I know people attempt it sometimes and then kind of throw it in the corner of the room and say, I'm never going to try and read this book again because apparently it's not very well written, or maybe it's not how much it was written, but the way it's formatted, I'm not sure. Like I said, I'm not a reader. How would you advise people to approach that book if they wanted to get more of Berne's thinking on systems?
I do think the book is deeply, deeply dodgy to read. It's got little veins of gold in it. So I think it's one of those books to randomly open. And there are lots of subheadings. Nothing's more than a couple of pages. The index is not useful. As I said, they had an editorial problem. It's a random dip. And whatever you do, skip the first chapter because it is very off-putting. I've talked to other TA people about why do they think Berne did that? Because he uses, as an organization, a seance, which is not a great example. It was very woo-woo. And I think the consensus seems to be that Berne was trying to say, so it was conscious, it wasn't ulterior, trying to say, if you can get through this and get this, then you'll get it. Maybe grappling with that very issue that I'm talking about, it's difficult to grasp. A system is not something you can grasp and boil down to a few easy things, even though lots of organizational training out there in the wider world would suggest that maybe it is. It's really complex and intangible, and bits are unobservable. It's a really difficult thing.
So it's not an A to Z read. It's a bit by bit as it takes your fancy.
I think so.
It sounds valuable at the same time if you do dip into it.
There are some real gems in there. Absolute gems.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please leave a review. Leaving a review allows more people to discover the podcast. Scroll down to ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts and click Write a Review. If you haven't already, please follow us wherever you get your podcasts from. We are available on all major podcast platforms. For more info, you can visit our website, www.tapodcast.com, or follow on all the usual social media platforms. This podcast is brought to you in partnership with the United Kingdom Association for Transactional Analysis, the European Association for Transactional Analysis, and our wonderful Patreon supporters.